All right, so now we're going to get the formal definitions for what I was kind of alluding to last section. So row echelon form, REF, that's when we have all the non-zero rows above any other rows of zeros. So see how there's rows of zeros that I've got at the bottom. Okay. Each leading entry, so leading entry means as you come in, the leading entry is to the right of all other leading entries. So this leading entry here is to the left, and every other leading entry is over to the right, and the next leading entry, so this one here, there's a leading entry, there's a leading entry, there's a leading entry. And all entries in a column below a leading entry is zeros. So all zeros below, right? Here's my leading entry, all zeros below. Okay, so I've given you examples with numbers, and I've given you example with stars and squares. So you need to know that a square is a non-zero number. So this is, let me get rid of this notation here. So this square is where the 1 would be. This square is where the 4 is. So these stars could be zeros here. These could be zeros, but these are leading entries that are non-zero, and then I've got my 2 rows of zeros. So it just was notation. There's no reason I made a difference between these square brackets or these round matrix brackets. Not a difference at all. All right, so here, leading entry on this row is here. Leading entry on this row is here. So the leading entry on the next row is to the right. So it could be a couple of spaces over, but it's over to the right. The leading entry here is all the way over here, and then the next row is to the right. So these are examples of REF. All right, examples of RREF. So RREF, the leading entry is a 1. So is a 1. The leading number on this row is a 1. The leading entry on this row is a 1. And then these have 2 rows of zeros, and those rows of zeros are always put at the bottom. So here on this, here's my leading entry of 1. Here's my leading entry of 1. My leading entry of 1. And my leading entry of 1. So if I have numbers that are not zero, I put, numbers that could be zeros, I put stars here, right? Stars could be zeros or numbers, but these are ones that I have to keep here. All right, so those are just, we're going to be using that, making forms like that. All right, so every matrix is equivalent to exactly 1 RREF. 1 RREF because it's unique with the 1s and the zeros below the leading entries and the zeros above the leading entries. All right, so as I'm coming in, it's called a pivot position, that leading 1. So every time I was kind of pointing to this, this is a pivot position, this is a pivot position, this is a pivot, and pivots are going to be really important. So pivots are, you identify them on the row, that's the leading 1 in the RREF. And every time we have a pivot position, we call this the pivot column, and we call this the pivot column. All right, so let's go for what we have here. So here we have a coefficient matrix. That means there's not an equal sign. It's not augmented. It's not a system. These are just the numbers in front of x1, x2, x3, x4. So we're going to do work to get it in REF. So REF doesn't mean there has to be 1s, right? The leading entry could be a number, but we want zeros below our leading number. So I want zeros below here. So I want to get rid of this 3. So I'm going to multiply row 1 by -3 and add it to row 2. And then just because I've got it here and you can think about it on your own, I'm going to multiply row 1 by -5 and add it to row 3. So I'll leave you to kind of check my arithmetic. I get to here, and I see that before I even go do anything, I can see that if I multiply this row 2 by -2 and add it to the row 3, I'm going to get a 0 here. So let me do that. So I get a 0 and a 0 and a -10. So this is REF. Remember, this is a coefficient matrix. This does not mean inconsistent. These are just the numbers in front of x1, x2, x3, and x4. So there's 4 variables since there's 4 columns. And the pivot positions are 1 and -4 and -10. Those are the pivot positions. Okay, so if I was to continue with this to get to RREF, then I would want to get a 1 in this position right here, and a 1 in this position right here. So I'm going to multiply by -1/10 and -1/4. So I do. So I've got 1s as the leading entries, the pivot positions, and I've got 0s below them. Now I want to get 0s above. So I want to get a 0 here. When I come back to here, sorry, I want to get a 0 here, and I want to get a 0 here and here. So these are the two I'm working on next. So if I multiply row 3 by -7 and add it to row 1, that'll get me the 0 here. And if I multiply row 3 by -3 and add it to row 2, I'll get a 0 here. And I'll let you check my arithmetic there. So the last thing I've got was 0s above this leading one. I need a 0 above this leading one. So I multiply this by -3 and add. -3 and add. So I get to here. All right, so these are my pivots. And this is RREF. All my pivots are the number 1. And these are my pivot columns. Pivot column number 1, 2, and number 4 are my pivot columns. And this is unique to this matrix. This is not a system. This is not an augmented thing. This is just a matrix.